My trekking pole tent pitches used to be horrendous. Loose, flappy edges, pitches that were too low to allow air to circulate inside, you name it. Best case, it makes your tent look gross. Worst case, you find yourself under a shelter that isn't storm-worthy as bad weather rolls in. But over time, I learned a few simple tricks for a nice tight pitch, specifically with the Zpacks Plex series of tents that I want to share with you today. I personally own both a triplex and a Plex Solo, and have had a fair bit of experience setting them up, but this should apply to any Plex tent and most trekking pole tents in general. First up, these aren't going to cut it for your main tie-out points. There's a temptation when buying an ultralight tent to get super UL stakes, but this usually isn't a great idea. These stakes have little to no holding power, especially in loose soil, and are prone to bending. They're great for non-essential points like panel poles, but for any of the main tie-out points that are going to be under lots of tension, you're going to want something with a bit more holding power. Instead, invest in a good Y-beam stake that's going to hold well in loose soil and won't bend when it hits a rock. This is going to allow you to get drum-tight tension on the shelter walls without fear of ripping out the stake at the opposite corner. Also, tent footprints aren't trapezoids. Well, some are, but not the Plex series tents. They're rectangles. This seems intuitive enough, but there's a temptation to simply stake down your corners, stick a trekking pole in it, and be done. This is how you end up with wrinkly edges rather than the angular spaceship-looking thing that you're going for. It's helpful instead to make 2 or more passes on your main stakes. Put them in once to establish the shape of your footprint, then go back around a second time to make sure that your corners are at 90 degrees. This results in good edge tension that'll get rid of most of the floppiness around the perimeter once the shelter's set up. Your shelter will look better, be more storm resistant, and it'll have more interior space. How often do you set up camp on a perfectly level spot? Unless you're in the habit of camping on football fields, probably not very often. This means that the spot where you put your trekking pole could be either higher or lower than the rest of the tent. So there's a good chance that you'll need to adjust your trekking pole a bit from the recommended height of the tent, 52 inches or 132 centimeters in the case of the Plex Solo. So don't be afraid to just put your trekking pole in with one of the sections collapsed, and then just raise it until the corners of the tent pull tight. Ideally, you're looking for the bathtub floor to be fully raised, about 8 inches or so, and the edge of the fly to be either at the same height or just a little bit below. So in summary, 52 inches is just a recommendation. These tents do have an optimal pitch height though, so don't go wild with it. This next one actually changed the game entirely for me when I learned about it. I realize that may sound like a gross exaggeration when it comes to something as straightforward as pitching a tent, but this little tweak took my pitches, especially on the triplex, from somewhat flimsy to drum tight. And it boils down to the fact that it's really tough to tighten a seam when you're pulling it at a perpendicular angle. This is especially noticeable with your peak tie-outs where the line runs at roughly a 45-degree angle from the tie-out to the ground. Instead of just pulling on that line as hard as possible, which isn't a great idea, and I'll touch on that a little bit more in the next section, take a moment to tighten things up a bit by grabbing the peak, pulling it forward, and then tightening the line. Above all though, you need to make sure that you're not permanently damaging your tent's ability to pitch well. One thing that you need to be aware of is that DCF is subject to something called creep. This is where the mylar that sandwiches the Dyneema stretches out when it's under load, typically in any direction that's not parallel to the Dyneema, since Dyneema is really strong. You'll notice it sometimes when you look at older DCF tents that have had a lot of use and the edges no longer get tight. Helicopters, man. It can be particularly noticeable on panel pullouts since the tension isn't running along any sort of reinforced seam. The easy fix here is just to not over tension your line, and I do this by tugging on the corner just a little bit with my fingers until it feels tight, and then I tension the line, rather than trying to crank it down until I break a sweat. With panel pulls, try pulling them out at a 90-degree angle, and that'll help get rid of any slack that's in the sidewall, while also putting less stress on the panel than if you were to try and pull it in the direction of the line. Remember, unlike lots of other tent fabrics, DCF really has no perceptible stretch, so you're not gaining anything by over tensioning it. Once it's tight, so you're good to move on. Finally, having a well-pitched tent is great and all, but it's only one small part of a much larger gear setup. And it doesn't really matter how great your tent is if the rest of your gear isn't reliable. So check out this video next to learn more about the best and most bomb-proof pieces of gear that I own.